Moonshiners, I welcome you to the Moonshine version 3 guide. And finally, we're moving on to the most interesting part, resources and pages. Now, we'll create our own resource. We'll see how to customize it. We'll talk about what's under the hood of its pages and what pages are. We'll focus a bit more on pages since they are the foundation. Yes, we know that everything is built on components, but any URL, any resource page, is still a page. The dashboard, all CRUD operations, and everything else you'll create, it's all based on pages. That's why we'll discuss them in more detail. As for this guide and the variety of fields in the admin panel, the multitude of features, we won't go through every method or property in detail. You'll have your own cases. You'll refer to the documentation, and with this fundamental knowledge of Moonshine, you'll easily use it. The main thing is to understand how it works under the hood, namely pages and resources. Let's create our first resource now and start diving in gradually. To create a resource, you need to use the command php artisan moonshine resource. The documentation also explains what a resource is in general. But since you have me, let's create it, and I'll explain everything to you visually. Okay, let's go back to our project. In the console, we run php artisan moonshine resource and press enter. Next, we'll be asked for the resource name. We have a fresh Laravel installation, so there are no models except for the user. Let's work with the user model. To avoid unnecessary steps, we can simply name the resource user. This way, Moonshine will automatically create a user resource, bind it to the user model, and we won't have to do anything else. Let's do that. Okay, enter. Next, the resource type. We have 3 types, but let's talk about them later. First, let's see what the first type is, so that when we look at the second and third, we'll understand why we need them. Okay, done. We see that our resource has been created. It's located in the app Moonshine Resources directory, and here it is, user resource PHP. It looks like this. What should we pay attention to here? Let's go to the admin panel and refresh the page. We'll already see changes. The user's menu item has appeared, and we can already interact with them. How did it happen that we didn't do anything, yet everything works? Actually, Moonshine automatically took our Moonshine layout PHP by default and added it to the menu. Friends, this is important. If you create a resource not through the console but by simply creating a class, extending it, or copying and renaming it, you'll need to manually add the item to the menu. But besides adding the menu item, you need to register it in the system. You need to indicate that this resource exists in the Moonshine system. To do this, go to Providers Moonshine Service Provider PHP and add the user resource class to the resources list. We did it through the console, so it was done automatically. But if you do it manually, always make sure the resource is declared in the system if you get a 404 error. Not in the menu, but here, in the system. The same goes for pages. When you add pages, they need to be declared in the system. But Moonshine does all this for you through the console. Okay, now we see the resource. What is it? If you've worked with Laravel, and I think you have, otherwise, you'll have a lot of difficulties with Moonshine. You're already familiar with the concept of resources for APIs, resources in OpenAPI specifications. In general, it refers to a specific entity, responsibility for the entity, in this case, the user resource, and inside, we have all the CRUD operations. Let's simplify it. A resource is a set of methods, convenient functions for interacting with CRUD pages. Inside the resource, we have a set of pages, namely the index page, which we see with the list. The add page, the edit page, and when we have some records, there's also the detail page. If we take the resource and look at the pages method, we'll see exactly these 3 pages, index page with the table, form page, which is also our edit form if there's an item ID, and detail page. Accordingly, you can redefine this set. You can specify your own set or keep what we had and add something else. What should we pay attention to in this method? Look, friends. When we added our resource to the menu through the filler, we already talked about fillers. They can be either simple strings, a page, or a resource. And Moonshine automatically populates the menu. If we look at the URL, we'll see that it's admin resource user resource index page, specifically index page. Why index page and not detail page or form page? The truth lies in this pages method. By default, the resource URL is the first page from the list in the pages method, which is index page. If you change it to something else, the menu will change. You'll have detail page or whatever you add. Keep this in mind, it's important. The set of pages can be anything, in any order, as you implement it in the future. Okay, let's go back to the resource and look at some other interesting properties. We see the title here. You can change it through the user's property or use the getTitle method and return a specific key here using a translation helper, so that your title works depending on the selected localization. This part happened automatically, that is, which model this resource belongs to. If you create it manually, you can specify it yourself. Let's leave it as is for now and move on to the next methods. These are 3 important methods that will automatically populate resources and pages based on the set of fields. Let's start with the form page since we don't have any users yet, and there's nothing to look at, but we'd really like to. Here we've gone to the add page. We have a save button, but no fields. If we click save, there's nothing to save. To specify which fields are needed in the form for saving, we need to populate form fields. Form fields work on both the create and edit pages. If you need to vary them, say, one set of fields on the create page and another on the edit page, you can use the condition this is update form page. This method will return true if you're on the edit page. Accordingly, isFormPage will return true if you're on either the edit or create page. Is create page only on the create page? You can do this simply through an if statement or through the canC method of the fields. And here, in the callback, you can pass this is update form page. And the field will only be present on the edit page. Okay, we've figured that out. Let's go to the model and see what we have in Fiable. We have name, email, and password. Let's implement all of this in the form. In the form, besides fields, and you can find fields in the documentation, let's look at the fields section. There are a huge variety for any needs. If you need a visual editor, Markdown, TinyMCE, or just a text area. If you need a date field, it's called date. For email, email. For phone, phone. Selects. Relationship fields. If you need a belongs to field, it's called belongs to. Belongs to many, respectively, belongs to many. You don't have to think too much. The field is named after the relationship. You'll figure this out without me, I think. And we'll cover more complex fields in separate guides. Okay, let's create a text field. Moonshine fields text make, and then specify what we had, name. If you're writing the admin panel exclusively in English, you can simply leave the label as name, and everything will work. You'll go to the page, and the name field will appear, with the input name being name in lowercase. If you're writing the admin panel for a non-English language, or if the automatic label transformation doesn't match the column in the table, you can specify the name as the second parameter. Friends, I want to draw your attention again to the fact that when we wrote the column, it highlighted the Fiable fields, name, password, as you can see, with the Metastorm icon. I recommend installing the Metastorm plugin, which will give you a lot of additional features when working with Moonshine, especially for autocomplete. To do this, go to the marketplace, find Metastorm, and install it. With this plugin, you'll have nice autocomplete, and writing the admin panel in Moonshine will be even faster. Okay, we've figured that out. We added the text field, it appeared, and it's ready to save. Let's also add an email field, which will be responsible for the email. How will it differ? It will be the same input, but the type will be email instead of text. And let's also create a password field. And let's add a password confirmation field. Password repeat. Or, what's the correct term? Password confirmation. Okay, let's go back and see how it looks. The form looks like this. We see everything in one box. Actually, form customization isn't just about fields. Here, you also have access to all Moonshine components, and you can design it however you want. You can do it like this, or you can, say, use grid make and add 2 columns. Okay, in one, let's have a box with a column span of 8. And let's make the second one 4. Since our grid is 12 columns, one is 8, and the other is 4. Here, we'll leave only the password. We can also add titles to the boxes. Let's say, here we have main information. And here we'll have password change. Okay, let's go back, refresh the page, and we'll see the updated page. If we don't want to see the password on the screen, for example, let's wrap it in a collapse. Like this. Let's go back and see that by default, it's not collapsed. We need to click Edit first, and then, if needed, we'll make changes. We've figured that out. Now, let's talk about validation, since we have a form. And here, I want to draw your attention again to the fact that validation is set through the rules method. But you shouldn't think that this is some independent validation inside Moonshine. We use Laravel's validator, and it works the same way. It validates not the fields but the request. That is, the request contains name, email, password, and you validate this request. It works exactly the same as in Laravel. Why am I emphasizing this? There are many questions in the chat, like, say, we're adding a file field, or let's say an image field for an image. We use make, let's say it's an avatar, even though it doesn't exist. And here, you add required. If we go back to the page, we see the field. If we add the required method, we see a red asterisk, but required is nothing more than an HTML required attribute. This means it will always require a file to be selected. It doesn't matter if you have a file in the database or if an image is displayed here, the file must be selected every time. These are fundamental HTML concepts, not specific to Moonshine. You need to understand this, and you should set required conditionally, perhaps. For example, if you have getItemID, or if you're on the isUpdate form page, only then should it be required. This way, by default, it's not required. Or you can add it if getItem or avatar is empty, then you make it required. If it's still empty, then it's mandatory to add it. And this required is at the HTML level. Plus, you have additional validation rules. Let's set name as required. String min3. Let's do the same for email, but specify that it's an email. If we switch to the existing resources, like Moonshine User Resource PHP, which handles the admin, we'll also see rules. We'll see email, name, and that email also has a uniqueness check. Here, we pass the current item and ignore it to avoid checking for uniqueness. We can also add that. We also see a validation rule for the password. And here, there's a check that will also apply to understand what's happening. We specify that the password, if the user already exists, doesn't need to be present in every request. We validate it only when it's there. But if the user hasn't been created yet, then of course, it's mandatory, and it must match the repeated password. This isn't Moonshine specific, it's just Laravel validation. Let's copy it. Let's not recall what the validation rule is called for the second field with confirmation. And let's make it password repeat instead of confirmation, so that it works. Now, let's go back and click Save. We see that the save doesn't happen because there are required fields that didn't pass validation. But this was a backend request, and in the request, we got a 422 error. So, we can additionally add HTML level required validation, which we already talked about. For now, if we don't fill in name, we won't proceed. Let's click Save, and it will ask for an email. Let's enter daniel@yahoo.ru. Now, we need a password. Let's set it to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and repeat it. Okay, let's click Save. We won't save anything yet, but we already see that a redirect happened. And we're not in the Create page anymore, we're in Edit. Let's click Save, and now we're editing. In the breadcrumbs, we see 1, but perhaps we'd like to see name or email. How can we change this? Let's go to the resource properties. And in general, I recommend setting the column field right from the start. It will be useful not just for breadcrumbs. For example, it's the visual representation of your record in one line. Let's set it to name. Okay, as you can see, Metastorm helped here too. Let's go back, refresh the page, and now we don't see 1. If you have a belongs to relationship with this resource, in the select, you'll also see not the ID but the column you specified. So, friends, congratulations. we've figured out the form page. Now, let's move to the index page and see what set of fields we'll have there. If we go back to the main page, we'll see that we only have ID. The table can be sorted, but there's only one record. What kind of sorting is this? We'll also look at that now. Any field you pass to the table can be marked as sortable, and the sorting will appear. Let's add more fields. We'll also have text here. And let's add email. In this case, we don't need any required fields. This is a table, not a form, and the set of additional methods will differ. Let's refresh the page, and we see a table that now includes both name and email. You can edit, delete, or view entries. But if you go to the detail view, it will still only show the ID, as this is a separate set of fields. Okay, we've figured that out. Similarly, if you need to sort by name, you add sortable. Okay, and now the name is also sortable. By default, it will generate a query like order by name ASC desk. If you need to customize this, you can use a callback. Here, you'll receive the query builder, and you can customize the sorting query as needed. This is also an important point, and you're not limited in any way here. Since we've started talking about tables, and yes, we're populating them, but this is a database query. There can be many fields, belongs to relationships, has many, and so on. This means additional subqueries. So, even in Moonshine, you shouldn't forget about query optimization, the n+1 problem, and so on. As for n+1 and eager loading, it's solved simply. You specify with and list everything you need to load via with. Friends, but since we've started talking about queries and query optimization, you might have a complex query that needs to be modified. Moonshine also provides all the possibilities for this. Go to ModelResource, in the Queries section. Here, you'll see sections like Modify Query Builder, which allows you to modify the query builder. You can also modify the query builder for the detail page, the form page, or when you're fetching a single item, like in the example with soft deleted records. We've already covered eager loading and many other queries. The search query at the top can also be customized or completely overridden. And we've already seen that for each field, you can add sortable and make it more complex via a callback. But also, at the resource level, you can use resolve order and completely rewrite the logic. There are many possibilities, and you need to be aware of them. At least skim through the documentation to see what's available. And when you encounter a problem, like seeing a slow query in debug bar, you'll immediately understand what's going on, go to the documentation, find the necessary methods, and fix the issue. Friends, as for working with tables and forms, I think even 10 hours wouldn't be enough to tell you about all the features and possibilities. Let's take a look at the demo and see that you can customize the set of fields with toggles. You can make the table header always visible on the screen. Or make buttons stick to the screen if the table is large. All of this is easy to do through customization. Right in the resource, you simply toggle states, modes, is lazy mode, the ability to select columns, sticky buttons, what I just showed you, and even the entire sticky table, and much more. This is a quick guide to the basics, so I can't spend hours showing you all the features. But I'll make separate lessons on specific complex fields. For example, I'll show you how to work with is lazy mode in tables, how to work with external APIs without additional backend requests, and much more. Now, let's go back to the resource, but we'll touch on something else important in the context of index fields. We've already understood that everything is components. That in components, we can set additional attributes. Let's take a look at that and smoothly transition to what I wanted to talk about. For example, we have a field, like name, which we see here. And we need to add some custom classes, styles, or anything else to this input. Let's take it and add custom attributes with a class of test. Okay, let's go back, refresh the page, and see that besides form input, we now also have test. You can change any attributes, but for class and style, there's a quick shortcut. You can do it like this, class, test, and it will still be applied. The same goes for style. Okay, so we've seen how to add additional attributes to the input. But we can also add attributes to the wrapper, the container. What is it? It's everything around the field, including the label, and the div with the class form group Moonshine field. How do we access it and add attributes? For this, we need custom wrapper attributes. So, there's attributes, custom attributes, and here, custom wrapper attributes. Let's add a class of test. Let's go back, refresh the page, and see that on the wrapper, next to Moonshine field, we now have the test class. What's my point here? You could have figured out these attributes and wrapper attributes on your own. But a common question in the chat is, how do we change the attributes of a table cell? For example, we have a cell with email or name, and we want to add some additional attributes, styles, classes, or something else. For this, we need to go to index fields and recall the same logic. We have custom attributes, which are added to the input. But in this case, there's no input. We have a field in preview mode. We'll talk about modes later, but there's a wrapper in the form of a TD, and we can interact with it. Similarly, custom wrapper attributes. And let's add, say, style width 200px. Okay, let's go back, refresh the page. We already see that something has changed, and what exactly? We observe here that the TD now has a style attribute. Actually, there are many other ways to interact with the table directly from the resource. You can also specify attributes through methods. TR attributes will apply to the entire row, not just a single TD. Similarly, you can interact with TD attributes directly through methods. In some cases, you'll set them through fields, in others through methods. It depends on what approach is more convenient for your case. Friends, in terms of populating fields, we still have fields on the detail page. They might not differ from the index page, and you can simply return index fields here. This way, when you go to the admin panel and open the detail page, you'll see the same fields. Alternatively, you might not need the detail page button at all. In that case, you'll need to go to the Active Actions section in the documentation and see how to exclude certain actions. We see that we have a collection, a list of active actions. We can exclude some of them, leave only specific ones, or completely override them and specify what we need. Let's copy the example, go to our resource, and add it at the top. Let's import and remove view. Okay, let's leave enum view. Let's go back to the dashboard, refresh the page, and see that the detail view is now gone. In the same way, you can remove deletion, editing, or even mass deletion if you don't need them. This is a quick way to customize the set of CRUD operations. Now, friends, let's go back to the documentation and go through the basics of ModelResource from top to bottom. I highly recommend familiarizing yourself with the basics. Don't just jump straight into tables or queries. Make sure to read the fundamentals. In ModelResource, in pages, and especially in fields, there's a lifecycle. This is very important information to understand how fields and everything else in Moonshine work. Okay, the basics. We've understood how to create resources. We've figured out the basic properties. We've seen what a resource looks like. We know that if we use the console to create it, the resource will automatically be declared in the system and added to the menu. But if we do it manually, we need to add it manually in the provider and in the menu. We've already familiarized ourselves with the menu, worked with it, and know what a filler is. And now we see, in a live example, how a resource filler automatically creates a menu item. Next, friends, we see the alias property. If we go back to the dashboard, we'll see that in the URL, we have admin, resource, user resource, and here, the alias is user resource. Using this property, you can override it and specify your own, or use a method if you need more flexible customization. Next, the documentation explains that using the getItem method, you can get the current model if it exists, or just an empty model instance. But here, I want to draw your attention to the fact that getItem retrieves the item from the URL. So, when the URL contains an item ID, like in the edit page, ID equals 1, we can use this item in the resource. If you try to use this item on the index page with the table, there's no item there, it will be null. This is a common issue for beginners and you try to use getItem in index fields. But it's not in the URL, it's only available in the context of cells, in the context of each field, but not globally here in the method. However, it's available in form fields, where you can easily interact with it using getItem. It will be present during updates and will be an empty model during creation. The same goes for the detail page, there's an ID in the URL, so it will be present. Friends, since this is a common question in the chat, why isn't getItem available here? Let me explain in detail. Here, the elements are iterated. So, getItem can't be directly available here, but we can access it from the context of the fields. For example, we have email, and we want to completely change the cell content. We use the change preview method. We see its default value and the context of the current field. Let's use value and the email context. Okay. Next, we have the context. And we can access getData, which contains the data. There's a proxy, so to get the actual model, we need to either cast it to an array or use getOriginal, and here we'll have the model. Then, let's say, email. Okay, let's go back, refresh the page. Nothing has changed because email and email are the same. Let's concatenate the actual value with the value from the model, and we'll see a duplicate. So, we can change the cell via change preview, and we have access to the data. In general, almost all methods available in field support closures. And inside the closures, you'll have the context. The data will either be passed directly, or you can access it from the field's context. Also, Moonshine has a convenient field for index tables called stack fields. It allows you to display multiple fields in a single cell. Let's take a look. Quick interaction, let's call it info. And we'll pass these two fields as an array. Refresh the page, and we see that in the cell, they're displayed side by side. We have all the components. You can add a line break, so they'll display one under the other, or a divider. So, depending on your imagination, you can customize the cell, but that's not all. Besides passing an array like this, you can also use a callback. And here, we'll also have the field's context. And you can get the data. For example, you can build conditions inside the cell. Let's say, if getKey equals 1, then let's have this set. Otherwise, let's have this full set. Let's go back, and we'll see that in the info cell, only Daniel is displayed because the ID is 1. But if we change it to 2, we'll see a different set in the cell. Here, you can customize it however you want. Fields, components, you can even display another table. Friends, as I've said a million times, Moonshine is not limited in its possibilities. It's only limited by your experience and how well you've understood the documentation. Or how well and attentively you're watching this guide. Okay, friends, let's get back to the documentation. You can't imagine how much I want to show you the other possibilities in the table. That you can add multiple rows for a single record, multiple Theat and T-body, quickly change fields directly in the table, and how to add your own buttons. I think even 10 hours wouldn't be enough to tell you everything. So, we'll cover separate topics in separate Moonshine lessons. Let's move further through the documentation. We see the section on modal windows. What is it? We can quickly observe this if we copy and paste it into the resource. You've seen that when you click on Create or Edit, additional pages open. In this mode, everything will happen in modal windows. You make changes, save them, and they're immediately reflected in the table. If you prefer this approach, use modal windows. Redirects. I think this is straightforward. We've already seen this. When we created a new user, we were redirected to its edit page. The getRedirectAfterSave method was triggered. By default, it contains the logic to redirect to the form page with the ID we received after creation. If it were an edit, we'd stay there. You can change this logic through the method. Or you can change it through the redirectAfterSave property. For example, you might want to specify that after saving, it should always return to the index page. Then you add this property and change it from form to index. Now, after saving, it will automatically redirect to the index page. For more complex logic, you can use the method to redirect anywhere, even to another site. The same applies to deletion. When you delete a record, after confirmation, the method will trigger and redirect to the main page by default. But you can also change this logic. We've already looked at active actions. You can exclude some actions, leave only specific ones, or completely override them with your own list. It's important that the list contains enum's action. Next, friends, let's talk about buttons. I think the action button component deserves its own big lesson. But since we've reached this section, let's see what it's about. Let's copy from here. We have a method with top buttons. Let's go to the resource and add it at the top. We'll make the necessary imports. For now, let's not focus on what's happening here. Let's go back to the dashboard and see our new refresh button next to create. So, top buttons are the buttons displayed here at the top. We clicked it, and as you can see, the table refreshes on click. This is achieved using a method we'll discuss later. But let's go back to the documentation and see what else awaits us here. We see that besides adding buttons to top buttons, we can also add them to the page itself. Adding new ones here or to bulk actions, we can also change their display. By default, they're just buttons, but they can be displayed in a drop-down. Let's see how this looks. Let's copy it. Refresh the page. And here, we're working not with top buttons but with index buttons. Index buttons are responsible for the table, and they're displayed here. As you can see, one button is standard, and the other is in a drop-down. If there are many buttons, you can place them all in a drop-down. By the way, there's a quick property for placing buttons in a drop-down. It's called index buttons in drop-down. You set it to true, and by default, all buttons will be in a drop-down. If it's convenient, use it. Let's go back. But I want to focus a bit more on index buttons. Let's revert it to how it was, with the method, and talk about it a bit. Let's have just one button here, without any display methods. We add it at the beginning and interact with it somehow. Imagine a situation where your URL isn't just a static string but needs to include the ID of the element. For example, we're working with row ID 1, and in the URL, we need to include this ID 1. Here, it's the same as with fields. Almost everything has callbacks, even in the URL. See, there's a closure. You just specify fn, and then, as far as I remember, you'll have the data here. Let's print it. Yes, and we see the user model right away. So, you can add a type hint. And specify, say, the URL like this, and then the key. Okay, and we see that the URL is /1. I want to emphasize this again. Almost everything in Moonshine has callbacks, and in the callback, you always get the context. Plus, some additional data, like in this case, the current item. This is convenient and allows you to interact with iterable objects, like here in the table. Friends, without straying from index buttons, I want to show you another case with action buttons. And how to work with iterable objects. The action button has an in-modal method, so you can open a specific modal on click. Let's set the title to Hello, and the content to World. Okay, let's go back, refresh the page, and on click, it will appear. And everything would be fine, but if we have, say, 2 records, let's create them. Then we'll encounter a problem. Both modals open at once. Why does this happen? Under the hood, action button and modal are 2 different components. The in-modal method is just sugar that adds them together. And on click, there's a trigger to open a modal with a specific name. By default, all modals have the name default. We didn't specify any name, so both modals have the same name. You clicked the button, and both opened because they have the same name. And if they're duplicated, like in a table, which is an iterable object, they'll be duplicated. You need to set a unique name for the modal. And here, you can't just set it as a string, like button, ID, etc. You need to use the same callback. Use user data. And specify a unique ID, like data, get key. Okay, go back, refresh the page, and now only one modal opens on click because it has a unique name. Let's go back to the documentation. We've looked at buttons, but very briefly. Keep in mind that these are buttons for top buttons, for the index page. There are similar methods for the form and the detail page, and you can customize and add your own. As for the form, there are even several types, and here you can add new buttons at the top as well. Let's go back to the documentation, and move to modifiers. So, friends, I'll remind you again, everything in Moonshine is components. This isn't some hack where we've drawn a custom table for the resource. It's a table component that you can use anywhere. On your pages, or here, adding a second one. And if you want to modify it or even replace it with something else, like displaying it as cards, for which we have a component, you can use the modifyList component method in the resource and return a different component. Or add certain attributes, classes, styles, we've already worked with this. The same goes for the form and the detail page. There's also a table builder, but in vertical mode, and you can customize it as well. Also, directly from the resource, you can add additional components via page components. For simple cases, this is convenient. But for more complex scenarios, you'll need to separate the resource into its own page and configure the page as you like. These are 3 pages, and you can publish them and completely change their appearance. They don't even have to be CRUD. They can display a delivery map or anything else. There are no limits. Let's go back, copy, and see what happens. Let's add page components. We had a specific modal here. Let's replace the modal with another component, off canvas. Let's name it like this and set it to open by default. Okay, let's go back, refresh the page, and see that a sidebar appears immediately. We can customize it, make it wider, and so on. So, we have huge possibilities here. You can open it on start or trigger it on an action button click, like we did with modals. In general, quick component addition. To see where exactly, let's do something else. Let's add a title. Go back, refresh the page, and see that the components are added at the bottom. And you'll definitely encounter a case where you want them somewhere else. That's when you publish the entire page and customize it there. But we'll talk about pages later. For now, let's remove this method. Let's go back to the documentation and see what else we have here. Right here, we see that components are added to the bottom layer. All pages are also divided into layers. Bottom layer, main layer, top layer. And when we talk about them, everything will become clear. Next, the lifecycle, an interesting section that I'm sure you'll interact with. When your resource is active, meaning you're currently in it. For example, right now, the user's resource is active, and the others are not. You can add logic for this state using the onload method. The documentation also provides a recipe, for example, on how to change breadcrumbs using onload. Let's copy and see. Let's do it. Like this, and let's take a look. So, when this resource is active, we take the form page and change the breadcrumbs. We can even vary them by page. Let's see. We need to disable modal windows because they don't have breadcrumbs and go to the edit page. As you can see, we've completely replaced the breadcrumbs with the ones we specified. And right here in onload, you can add additional logic. If the page is such and such, add this and that. We've already worked with assets. You can use Get Asset Manager from here to add some assets only for the active resource. From here, you can add components to a specific layer. If you want, let's see how this works. This, Get Index page, push to layer, and we'll talk about layers. Let's choose a layer. Earlier, we added components to the bottom layer via page components. Now, let's change it and add to the top layer, okay, and add a title component. Hello. Okay, let's go back. Here, we changed the breadcrumbs, so it's not what we expected. And we see the hello component in the top layer. This is a quick approach. Again, friends, you can interact directly from the resource. Moonshine provides all the possibilities for this, but it's better not to be lazy. Publish pages and customize them as you like. Let's go back to the documentation. Friends, since we've seen a recipe, I strongly recommend going through all the recipes. There are very interesting recipes here. For example, the first one shows how to implement full authentication, all flows, create a personal account, and use Moonshine templates and components outside the admin panel. We've also talked about the index page, modify list component. And here's a live example of how to replace the table with a cards builder and display it as cards. There are many interesting recipes, I recommend checking them out. Okay, let's go back. Next, we see that in the resource, you can use traits. And if inside the trait, you specify a method name with the trait's name and prefix it with load, this trait will be called here in onload. This way, you can create packages with just traits. You'll tell users to connect all functions via the trait. They'll add the trait, and when the resource is active, certain actions will be performed. As we see in the example, on the form page, a component for selecting permissions is added to the bottom layer. Also, in the lifecycle, besides onload, we see the onBoot method. It's different. Here, we interact only when the resource is active, but onBoot is called when Moonshine creates an instance of post resource under the hood. This happens almost immediately. When Laravel is bootstrapping, and Moonshine starts bootstrapping, all resource instances are created. And for this, there's also a trade approach. I've already shown you how to work with assets via onload, and this is also covered in the documentation. Next, there are more complex topics that I think you'll explore when you become professional Moonshiners. I think you already know that Moonshine works like an API with JSON responses via JWT tokens. And you can also modify these responses. So, friends, we've covered the basics. We've understood how to interact with fields, but we're not yet experts in Moonshine fields. Now, we're moving to pages, but we'll talk about them in the next guide. This is a crucial section. As I said, everything in Moonshine is pages. When we navigate somewhere, it's a page with a set of components. So, we'll discuss this in a separate lesson. In the remaining time, let's quickly go through the remaining features of the resource. There are many of them, so we'll briefly look at these possibilities. After the lesson on pages, we'll dedicate a lesson to fields and components to understand how they work under the hood. And in the future, in separate lessons, we'll explore additional interesting topics like frontend, security, controllers, writing custom fields, components, and so on. There's a lot of information I want to share with you, and I'll do my best to cover it. That's all for now, friends. See you in the next lesson. Don't forget to like, comment, and join our Moonshine community chat for developers and users. We'll be happy to have you there. That's all for now. See you in the next video on the Moonshine Video Guides channel.